if you've noticed throughout the training, I've been referring to what's different, what's the same. So what I thought I would do is just kind of like put it all together in one place, kind of categorize it for you to look at what's different, how it's different, and then the most important part is what implications does it have for your practice and for your work, okay? So some of this will be redundant, but my hope is that you'll find it organizing what you've been hearing that's been a bit fragmented throughout the presentation. So I'll start with that whole issue of pre-existing relationships, because I think that is so fundamental to how kinship care is different. If we go back to the triad of the caregiver, birth parent, birth child, what's significant is that in kinship care, there's a pre-existing relationship between the members of that triad, which does not exist between non-relative foster and adoptive parents. And by what I mean by in terms of a pre-existing relationship is that it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a pre-existing interaction, because you may be placing a child in California who's never met that aunt or uncle, but there was a pre-existing relationship. That aunt and uncle has been thinking and relating to that child as aunt and uncle. Now they're going to have to switch that to parent. That's what I'm talking about, changing pre-existing relationship. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's pre-existing interaction, but that aunt and uncle has to now go from the mindset of, I have to now think in terms of the parent. I now have to assume the role and responsibilities of that birth parent that weren't mine before. And what made me aware of that is when I was working with a family on the West Coast who was just getting the child, and this was an aunt, and the aunt actually said, well, I can't make those decisions. I'm the aunt. So mentally, she was still thinking like an aunt. Even though she hadn't really known the child or worked with the child, that pre-existing relationship and title of aunt, she now had to transition to parent. Foster parents, adoptive parents, they don't make that transition. They automatically start thinking as foster parent, adoptive parent from day one. For a relative caregiver, it's kind of like making that transition. She didn't really have that much relationship with the birth parent. But in her mind, well, don't I need to contact her mother to get permission to do? Still thinking in the mindset of aunt. And again, we had to let her know, no, it's changing and thinking in terms of the sense of parent. Foster parent, they're not thinking about, do I need to call the birth parent to make, they don't think that way. Adoptive parent's not going to think, well, guys, maybe I need to get in touch with that birth parent to see if I can enroll the children in school. They don't think that way. But for a relative caregiver, they're thinking that way, and that's kind of like that change in terms of roles and relationships where pre-existing, can impact. Number two, need to redefine those pre-existing relationships. I guess what's significant about that is that for relatives in kinship care, members of the family, that triad again, they tend to be thinking, and not just the triad, but the extended family as well, that I have the same rights and privileges and entitlements that I had before the child was placed, before the child was moved. So whatever those rights were, whatever that authority was, whatever that decision-making was, whatever that hierarchy was, they're still expecting to still be in that same position as they were before the child was moved. So that's the work for that caregiver, to work with their family members to accept their new role, to get their family members to realign with them and support their relationship, to not collude, to deal where there's resistance. That's the work of the relative caregiver. Foster parents, they come in as foster parents. And clearly, even if the child is moving into the family, there's no pre-existing relationships with that birth parent or with that child that needs to be changed. So again, that's kind of what's making the difference. And that's the challenge, and as well as dealing with loss and resistance and collusion and sabotage. That's kind of like the consequences of not dealing with that. Or sometimes that might be the indicator that, hey, something's wrong, they're not accepting. And that's where assessments do come into play, like asking questions about, well, do you know that your role is going to change? Do you know you're going to have to be the disciplinarian? And if you get a response, no, I'm still going to ask the mom, red flag. They're not clear about what's happening and what a change is. So that's where those assessments kind of come in, those questions, Well, how is your sister going to, how is your daughter going to feel about you caring for that child? Well, I don't know. That needs to be followed up, needs to be looked at. That could be a potential issue for the kinship caregivers, or finding out what those feelings are so that they can, family group decision making is very useful. If you haven't been using it, or is it something that you have access to, family group decision making is something that I would recommend in dealing with changing roles and relationships and redefining roles and relationships in the family. Because the family's in a situation where they can look at how we make decisions, who tells who what to do, what authority has shifted, how the loyalties have changed, what's the status in the family. So if you have access to family group decision making, this is where you can deal with a lot of those issues as well. For the child, even makes a difference. Who now tells me what to do? And then how can the family reinforce that? They've got to support that. There's certain dialogues that you need to have, that birth parent have with the child. And you want to make sure those dialogues occur. When grandmom speaks, she speaks for me. You can trust them. They've got to be able to defer that authority. They've got to be able to acknowledge that relative caregiver's competency. They've got to give the children permission to accept that relative caregiver's nurturance, to accept those relative caregivers' decisions and authority. So there are things that need to happen, and there are dialogues that need to be occurring between members of the triad in order for that to work. Okay? And that's the setting where that can happen, is in family group conferencing. Loss and grief. Now I feel like I'm turning into grief counselors, but even if you don't do it, you still want to assess it. See, the fact is that there is that pre-existing relationship with that birth parent. Even if you don't like them, you can still hurt for them. And those birth parents can be in pain, and those relative caregivers can be angry with them, but they can still, because of pre-existing relationships, attachment and bonding, they can still feel loss. They can still feel hurt. They can still feel grief. All those stages, okay? And you need to find out where that relative caregiver is so that they'll have an appropriate place to place those feelings, so that they won't place those feelings and take it out on who? The child. That's why you have to deal with that, okay? So it's not just a clinical issue, it really has to do with their being, that relative caregiver being able to provide the safety, to implement the plans, to provide the nurturance, to provide the energy, and emotionally be there for the child. But if their emotions are caught up in loss and grief, where are they? Where can they take those feelings? How do we keep those feelings from carrying over into the kinship family? How do you make sure that those feelings don't impact their ability to provide permanency, safety, and protection? That's the implications for your work. That's why you need to kind of address it and make sure that they're addressing. And those lost feelings are cyclical. You know how loss and grief, it doesn't just go away at one time. They may take them in and deal with that adjustment around loss and grief, and then all of a sudden you're talking about legalizing and formalizing the relationship. That can trigger that whole process again. Because now we're talking about from going informal to formal, which means petitions, going to court, and that's going to trigger those losses again. How is it going to impact that that birth parent? And they feel it. Even though they know it's the right thing to do, here we go again. There's another painful situation. Or if they have to go through termination of parental rights, here we go again. Those issues get put in. And I guess the whole point is, if you don't address those clinical emotional issues, it can stop your permanency plans. If you don't address those emotional issues around loss and grief, all of a sudden you find ambivalence and you find regrets. And the next thing you know, they're not following through and you're wondering why. It looks like they're just not turning in the paperwork, or they're not coming to the appointments, or they're not following through with the agreements, or they're not going to the therapy sessions. They're not meeting with their attorneys. So you see, but those may be just symptoms of what's happening emotionally. So sometimes you have to kind of what's underneath it? What are you feeling? Why aren't you doing it? Because we weren't asking those questions. We were just thinking, oh, they're not following through. They don't have discipline. They lack structure. They lack commitment. No, they're in pain. They're feeling the loss. They're feeling the hurt. And we've got to work through those kinds of things, okay? Mixed feelings about loss of roles. I think that's pretty apparent. It's the loss of being a grandparent, aunt, uncle, and the enjoyment of those roles. There's certain benefits to being an aunt, to being an uncle, to being a grandparent, and then it's a loss for them, okay? While for kinship families, for non-kin, they're excited about their new roles. Look forward to it. There's nothing to miss because they never had it, all right? And I know that sounds real strange. No previous roles to miss, but when you've had a chance to be the aunt, the uncle, the grandparent, and then have enjoyed it, and now you have to give up that relationship, have to give up their roles. Again, loss, grief is something that you have to kind of address. Decision to become a caregiver is unplanned in a crisis. Request for parent or child protection. I don't know too many caregivers, and I think I talked to you about this before. I don't know too many caregivers who voluntarily pursue becoming a kinship caregiver. They're not calling up DIFAS or DHS saying, I'd like to become a caregiver. Could you give me some information about how to become a caregiver? Is there any training? And you know what? I'd like to specialize in special needs children and trauma. They're not doing that. Foster parents, adoptive parents do that. It's a decision that they want, that it's planned. In fact, the reason why that's so important is they know they want to do it before they commit to doing it. Caregivers, they're committing to do it before they know they want to do it. That's the difference. And they miss that whole step of knowing that they want to do it, and planning it and being motivated to do it. Look at your responses to that exercise earlier today. Shock. Unplanned. How long? Remember all those ambivalent questions that you were asking? And it all has to do with how they come into kinship care. For the non-kin, it's a decision to become a caregiver. It's planned, pursued. And then the next one is that there's limited preparation. Foster parents, adoptive parents have the training and the support before the child comes into the home or shortly afterwards. For relative caregivers, it's after the fact. They're having a child come into the home with the special needs issues, with the concrete issues, with the material needs, and there's none of that in place for that. So the limited preparation prior to the child's placement, and the implications of that is that it can impact their ability to commit. It can impact their ability to follow through, and it can increase their ambivalence. So if you know they're going to be having limited preparation for it, you've got to start already coming in with those discussions around, now I know you don't have the bedding, I know you don't have the food, I know you don't have a school selected, this is what we're going to be doing, and this is how we can help you. So that's the implications for your practice in terms of coming in ready for those questions, ready for knowing what their limitations might be, and then how are we going to handle it? How do we plan for it? Unanticipated requirements to become foster and adoptive parents. For foster and adoptive parents, they know what the requirements are before they become a foster and adoptive parent, and they have to meet the requirements before the child is placed. They have to be licensed. Adoptive parents have to have approval, okay? They have to have the certifications before the child is placed. For a relative caregiver, it's after the fact. What hit home for me is when I heard a relative caregiver say, if I knew I had to go through all this, right, maybe I wouldn't have. Now the good thing about it was it's kind of like what you don't know didn't hurt you. If they had known all that, they probably would have said no. So it was really kind of like to our advantage that they didn't know. Okay, it's like having children. If you knew what you were going to go through, that's a bad analogy, isn't it? But you can think about it. You think about it. If you knew, you might have had second thoughts. But it's kind of like not knowing. Ignorance is bliss. So yeah, that's kind of what happens here with kinship caregivers. It's blissful because they don't know, but then once they realize it, oh my goodness, I've got to go through the criminal background checks, I've got to go through the preparation, I got to get the clearance, I've got to do the home study. So again, it's unanticipated requirements, and the fact is you need to kind of know once they become aware of the requirements, how do I get them through it? Okay. What's the steps? Partialize it, baby steps so that they're not overwhelmed. That's the implications for your practice, because they're going to feel overwhelmed. And even if you say, and it's so funny if they say, you didn't tell me about all that. You didn't tell me about all this, and you did, but they only hear selectively what you said, So that's the other part with unanticipated, So it's kind of like, be prepared for a backlash, be prepared for being scapegoated, and kind of normalize what they're going to say so that you won't personalize it. Feeling guilty or responsible for the birth parent's problems. That's that guilt. Remember those cues? Is it my fault? Did I do something wrong? Are they in a position because of what I didn't do? Feeling guilty about the child becoming more attached to them than to their birth parents. So just kind of like think about the sources and then think about those scripts that you have to go through. Non-kin, they're not feeling guilty. They're not feeling guilty about becoming a foster parent. They're not feeling guilty about becoming an adoptive parent. If anything, they're excited about it. So, and they're not feeling responsible for what happened. They don't feel like it's their fault. Ambivalence, guilt, resentful for having to assume that parental role. Again, we used to think that they should be happy. They should be excited about it. But for a grandparent who's already been through it, no, look at your own responses. For those who have already been through it, it was like trauma. Your symptoms were interesting. Shock. Oh, not again. Second time, I can't handle it, can't cope with it. Yeah, enjoying now being able to play with the children. Grandparents have fun, aunts have fun. And now you've got to go back to saying no and having to deal with the fallout. Think about the developmental stages you have to take them through. Oh, no, adolescence, here we go again. Oh, terrible twos, here we go again. So it's kind of like, and it can cause some resentment and it can cause some ambivalence. So again, what's important here is in your work, normalizing those feelings, being aware of the fact that they're going to have those feelings. Remember that work that we talked about, getting them to go through a process to determine if they want to do it before they commit to doing it, because they've missed that stage. So that's the implication there, about going back, and then what are those benchmarks that are going to let you know that you can do it? That's where this piece becomes so important in terms of your practice. What do we need to do so that you'll determine, and committing not to necessarily becoming a permanency option, but let's commit to a process to determine if you can and should become a permanency option for this child. So that's where that piece becomes real important in your work. Non-kin, they embrace it. They kind of like know what they want to do. They're looking forward to it. Feelings, they are betraying or competing with birth parents by assuming a legal or formal relationship. It's the whole idea of I'm replacing the birth parent that triggers those feelings. Betraying or competing. I'm competing for that child's affection and attachment. That can trigger those feelings of as if you're competing or betraying. For the non-relative, they don't feel disloyal. Their loyalty is to the child first. We talked about that before. So assuming a legal responsibility and a legal relationship, if anything, they look at that as a way of demonstrating their commitment. They look at that as a way of formalizing their commitment. For relative caregivers, that can be looked at as a way of identifying, of making you appear as though you're betraying or making you feel as though you're in competition. Considers and pursues a formal relationship as a last resort. Now, I know this sounds real strange, but anybody who's involved in family finding, this is where it really had a lot of implications, because we would go out, contact a relative caregiver, let them know about the children, and their initial response was no. So we would say, okay, and that would be it. We would move off, we wouldn't have anything to do with them, and that was the end of it. What we didn't realize is that relative caregivers look at themselves as the last resort, not the first resort. They don't want to have to make a decision to commit around adoption or legal arrangements unless they have to. They look at themselves as the last resort if you can't get the children back home, the last resort if you can't get the birth parent to work through the service plan, the last resort if the birth parents aren't able to follow through with service plans. They don't look at themselves as the first resort. They may look at themselves as a first resort in terms of being heir to help the child, but in terms of formalizing and legalizing a relationship, I'm the last resort. And the reason why is I don't want to look like I'm in competition, and I don't want anybody to feel as though I'm betraying. So those loyalty issues can get in the way. It drives, I used to see judges and attorneys get so upset. They get to the point of termination, and guess who's coming all out the wall? They're coming to all the meetings. Ken. And they're so upset, or the foster parent is getting ready to go into adoption, and then here come all these relative caregivers saying, hey, here we are. And they would say, why didn't you step up at the beginning? And then we would write it up as, oh, well, you're ambivalent, you can't make a decision, weren't able to make a commitment. No, it was about loyalty, competition, and not wanting to be looked at as betraying the birth parent. So the work here, for anyone that you know that's involved in family finding, expect relative caregivers to say no at first. You're going to have to come back again. And they will consider themselves the last resort. Your work here with relative caregivers is, when will you know it's time to step up? That's your work. What's the criteria that's going to let you know you need to develop a plan and make some decisions about being involved with that child? So what's your criteria? What's your timeline? What are the benchmarks in that birth parent's process that's going to let you know that you need to make a commitment and step up to being involved with the child? That's your work with them. That's the conversation with them. For the non-kin, step right up. In fact, when is the court date? They're pushing for it as fast as they can. What's the waiting list? Want them to push it as fast as they can. Kin may feel in competition with the birth parents if the child becomes more attached. Well, you know what that's all about. Okay. Yeah, children are starting to call them mom. If anything, there's kind of a resistance in some cases. Your work is to make relative caregivers feel comfortable with that attachment, to accept those new roles, to look at it as necessary and in the best interest of the children, to have that attachment with them, and to live with the guilt when it does occur, because that's the work there. Live with the guilt, understand that it's necessary, and then how do you work around those feelings that may get in the way of you wanting to back off. For kin, non-kin, they want that child to call them mom as soon as possible. They want that adoption to happen as soon as possible. As a therapist, I was frequently working with adoptive families where they were coming in, he won't call me mom. They were coming in with that concern. He won't say he loves me. Relative caregivers, it could be just the opposite. I'm not mom. Please stay attached. Even if they didn't like the birth parent, the fact still was that they didn't want to feel in competition. They didn't want to feel that tension. For non-kin, it's no problem. They want that attention. They want that attachment. Split loyalties, hesitation to legalize, well, we kind of talked about that. You can see where that's coming from. But it's the issue of having to place the needs of the children over that of the birth parent. That keeps coming up over and over again. And it's that feeling of betrayal when you do it. Non-kin, motivated, highly motivated. And they do prioritize the children because their attachment and bonding is with the children first. This embarrassment piece. Kin can be embarrassed for the reasons why they become caregiver. If you become a caregiver because maybe your son or daughter has been deployed, or your son and daughter has gone to another city to look for a job, or your son and daughter have had medical problems and that's why you're taking in, you don't have a problem with the being kin. If anything, it's not stigmatizing. But if there's an issue of neglect or abuse or opioid use or drugs and alcohol or domestic violence, that stigmatizes. All of a sudden, you're not on the pedestal any longer. And relative caregivers have to deal with that. Let me make it personal for you. If your brother and sister does something in the community looks at that as a reflection on who? Your family. Right. Now, if it's positive, you embrace it. If it's negative, well, I didn't have anything to do with him. I don't know him. You know what I mean? Okay, I'm kind of joking, but can you see what happens? Yeah, when you're a family member and that family member, if you're in a family and a family member does something in the community, yeah, the community is going to be thinking about, well, what's wrong with your family? What happened to you? And hopefully if it's positive, no problem. But if it's negative, you can feel it. And relative caregivers feel the embarrassment. Foster parents, adoptive parents, they don't feel the embarrassment. If anything, they're on the pedestal. That's great. How could you do that? We admire you. But for relative caregivers, yeah, we admire you and we're glad you're doing it and we think that it's great that you're doing it, but what's wrong with is the other part of that thought. What's wrong with your family? What's wrong with your child? What did they do that made you have to take these children in? So it's that embarrassment. And the way the embarrassment can get in the way is that embarrassment can stop relative caregivers from pursuing permanency, pursuing legal relationships. That embarrassment can even get in the way of getting services for the children. Now, I don't want to go through another intake. I've seen caregivers do that. So the implication there is, how do we help relative caregivers negotiate the system? How do we help relative caregivers explain why the child is with me? Your work is going to be around, how do you help the relative caregivers disclose to friends and family why that child is with me? Who needs to know? Who has a right to know? And how much do they have to know? Have a right to know. Those are the three things you've got to talk to relative caregivers about. Who needs to know? What do they need to know? And what do they have a right to know? And guess who else they have to do this with? The children. That's the other part that goes with disclosure. Not only do they have to know how to disclose, they also have to teach that to the children. In fact, they also have to do that with the children. So that whole embarrassment piece, the work there is around disclosure. How do we disclose to the children? How do we disclose to the community? How do you not let embarrassment get in the way of accessing services that you need on behalf of the children? And how do I support you? Do I need to accompany you to this intake? Do I need to set up the appointments for you with this intake? What part of the story do you need to tell and what part do you need me to tell? Kind of conversations you have with them. And the last one, feels that involvement with outside agencies is an intrusion and that agencies and courts' approval to be a caregiver is unnecessary. That's kind of wordy. Let me make it real personal for you. Okay, all right. A foster parent and adoptive parent, their sense of entitlement to take care of and raise that child is based on what? What makes them feel as though that they are entitled and have the right to raise that child that they've adopted or that child that's the foster child in the home? What makes them feel that right? They've been approved through the agencies. You make them feel that way. Yeah. The home studies, the interviews, the supports you give them, the evaluations that you send about them being appropriate. Yeah, that's what makes them feel as though they have a right. For a relative caregiver, what makes them feel as though they have the right to take care of that child, to raise that child? Blood relationship. We sound like vampires here, yeah, blood. Yeah, it's blood. Yeah, that's what gives me the right. That's why they belong here. So therefore, they don't feel as though they need your approval. In fact, they feel as though your approval is an intrusion. In fact, they may feel as though they're doing you what? A favor. By letting you into their homes, by cooperating with you, by agreeing to become a foster parent. Yeah. So what you're doing feels like an intrusion. Therefore, I'll be more specific. The home studies, the weekly visits, the therapy sessions, all those things can feel like intrusion because they don't feel as though they need your approval. They don't feel as though they need to prove to you that these children should be here with me. So your work here is acknowledging, yeah, I kind of start out like this. You know what? Thank you so much for taking the children. We know you didn't really have to, and I know my being here is an intrusion, and I know you really don't feel like dealing with me, but these are the things we need to do in order to let everyone else know that it's in the child's best interest to be with you. And that usually kind of gets the ball rolling. You don't have to prove it to me. And by you letting me see me, by you meeting with me, allows me to let them know that it's in the child's best interest to live with you. So that's why we need to go through, and then you hit the list after that. Home study, licensing, parenting classes, foster parent training, but it all relates back to we need to let them know that it's in child's best interest to be with you. But you need to acknowledge the fact that it is an intrusion, and even thank them for letting them allow you into their home and for having taken that child into their home. Because now don't get me wrong, foster parents and adoptive parents, they feel like it's an intrusion too. Oh my goodness, they can tell you the horror stories. But they're willing to do it because they need your approval. For relative caregiver, it feels like intrusion again because I don't need your approval. If anything, I know as much about raising children as you do. So, I'd like to end with this. These are the basic points, the basic differences. I hope you'll be able to find this useful in your practice, and thank you so much for coming.